Good evening and welcome to the first in our new series of 5x15 teaming up with Rathbones Investment Management to bring you the Earth Convention, which is a series of topical talks which zero in on the climate crisis. We've decided this year to take the theme of earth, air, fire and water, and to look at the four elements and what they mean in terms of what's going on with them, what we can do to try to make things better. And we've assembled an absolutely sensational groups of people, 4 people each panel. They'll be coming to you every fourth Monday of the month, and we'll keep you posted on those dates. So the first panel tonight, which is clearly on Earth, which is about the ground beneath our feet, and it's about everything from farming to wildlife to biodiversity to the impact of carbon credits on the soil, and really what we're going to do about this very crucial resource on which we all obviously depend. The format is really simple. Each speaker is going to talk for about 5 minutes. I will introduce each one as they come, and then all 4 of us, 5 plus me, will come together and we'll chat among ourselves, and then it's over to you. So please put your questions into the DERSRA Q&A box, and we'll come to as many as we can. And I have to say already the audience has sent in quite a lot, so I'm already well armed. Now, if you have, and I hope you won't, if you have any tech problems, there is and should be a button somewhere around on your screen which says technical assistance, and DERSRA will help you get back in. So, with no further ado, let's start this evening, and I'm completely thrilled to be welcoming our first speaker, the wonderful Isabella Tree, who is the author of the massive bestseller Wilding, which told the story about how her and her husband Charlie Burrell took over the estate that they inherited, which was a farming estate when the end of the 90s, and the farming was frankly going nowhere, which Isabella is extremely honest about if you read the book. They became a rewilding heartland, and indeed if you go there today, you walk around and you'll see scientists peering into the earth at every corner. But the results have been phenomenal, including now the reintroduction of beavers, as well as the most nightingales in the UK, and many, many other wonders. So Izzy's new book is called The Book of Wilding, and that's going to tell us all, when we've only got a small garden, how we can do rewilding as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Isabella. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rosie. Thanks very much for having me. The great American biologist E.O. Wilson calculated that in one of his last books, Half Earth, that if we want to save the life support systems on which all life on our planet, including our own, depends, then we must devote half the land on our planet to nature. That's significantly more than the ambitions of the recent COP15 in Montreal, which pledges 30%. And we don't know how we're going to get to that. So the question is, how do we spare all this land for nature? How do we get nature back into our lives? I think, one of the obvious problems we have, fragmented, depleted, cut up world where nothing connects anymore, and nature and species are on the back foot, many of them at risk of extinction. And clearly we need to get nature back fast, or we are beyond the tipping point from which there is no return. Well, I think our experiment at NEP, modest though it is in the scheme of things, but it does, I think, show a way. 20 years ago, as Rosie said, we were intensively farming arable and dairy. Like most conventional farmers, we were throwing chemicals on the land, we were depleting our soils, polluting the water, and unwittingly, we were killing off wildlife. We had very little nature of any note to speak of. Despite all our best efforts, farming on our land was never going to be profitable. We are marginal land. We're simply on the wrong land for modern intensive agriculture. So we decided to rewild, to essentially turn the estate back to nature. And within 20 years of rewilding, NEP has now become, as Rosie was describing, one of the most significant biodiversity hotspots for nature in the UK. And this is, in the most concentrated, developed part of the UK in southeast England, just 40 miles from London. The sheer abundance of wildlife has been astonishing. It's astonished anyone who's been involved with NEP, but so too has the rarity of the species that have found us. Rosie mentioned the nightingales, the turtle doves. Every year there's a new species that arrives that gets the conservationist into a complete spin. So it's an incredibly positive story that nature bounces back if you let it. But we've also learned to know that it's not just about wildlife. So we're now providing other things that humans desperately need. We're providing clean air, we're providing clean water. We've gone from being a huge carbon emitter under intensive farming to now being a really significant carbon sink. So NEP is now addressing the twin problems, that the crises that are facing the planet at the moment, which is biodiversity loss and climate change. So as we see it, rewilding is the perfect, easy, very low cost, very low carbon way to get nature back into our lives and to provide all those vital public goods. And essentially, you don't have to own thousands of acres to be able to do it. Rosie mentioned the book, The Practical Guide to Rewilding, the Book of Wilding that we're just about to bring out in May, which shows how we perceive rewilding to be on a spectrum. So at the one end, you have Yellowstone, where you don't need to do too much intervention. In the middle, somewhere, you have NEP, where you have certain interventions to help kickstart natural processes again. But you can also rewild in your own backyard. Literally, if you have a roadside verge or even a window box, we all have a part to play in embracing nature and bringing it back. The big question we're always asked is, how does food production fit into all this? Surely we need more than that land to produce food. Where does rewilding fit? I can't, too complicated the question to talk about food security here. And anyway, I'm not the best person to talk about it. Philip Limbury is much, much better on that than me. But we do need productive land for agriculture, it seems to me. We need productive land for food production. But we need to change that land into regenerative agriculture, so that instead of depleting our resources and endlessly polluting our environment, we remain productive and actually can produce sustainably for future generations. But rewilding, I think, has a key part to play here, and quite often it's demonized. People talk about either rewilding or regenerative agriculture. We see rewilding as actually being farming's greatest ally. It is the way that we're going to be able to provide those life support systems, to have rewilding running like a web through all our landscapes, but including our farmland, bringing landscapes literally back to life. We know that fields that are bordered by nature can produce higher yields. We know that rewilding can provide the biodiversity hotspots like NEP and existing nature reserves and the green corridors to connect them, but it will also provide the life support systems for farming. It can restore the soil and can restore water resources. It will provide the insects to pollinate the crops. It will provide the predators to predate on the pests that attack crops. And it will provide buffers to protect farmland from the extreme weather events, which we're going to be having more and more frequently and in bigger intensities in the years to come. It can return trees to the landscapes as well without the need for planting them, which has a carbon cost and which is also very poor for biodiversity. So rewilding, I think, should be seen as completely integral to productive farming and the life support system that will help bring us all back to a sense of belonging in the planet in which we live. We simply cannot live without nature, and rewilding is an easy way to get it back. Thank you. Rosie, you're on mute, I think.
Izzy, thank you so much. That was absolutely terrific, and you're quite right. I think that rewilding is part of the pattern that we need to see in the future. And obviously, you touched on the whole issue of food growing. So next up, I'm incredibly pleased to introduce Philip Limbry, who is the Chief Executive of Compassion in World Farming. And Philip is a fantastic advocate for, well, literally, if we're going to eat animals, let's treat them better. But I think he'd like to see that become something of the past. And he's also someone who's become very aware of big food security issues. His last book had the very chilling title of 60 Harvests Left: How to Reach a Nature-Friendly Future. So now, with no more ado, let me hand over to Philip, who's going to talk about ending factory farming. Philip.
Rosie, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be here with you, and what a thrill to be following Izzy Tree. I remember quite some years ago now, going on my first visit to Knepp, and I went through the formal entrance. I went through the gates into the perfectly manicured deer park and up to the castle, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm wasting my time here. And I met with Izzy and with Charlie, and Charlie took me through the back door into where the rewilding was happening. And honestly, it was like Alice through the looking glass into a different world, and it blew the sides off my imagination of what was possible, and has been my abiding inspiration ever since. So Izzy, thank you so much for the work that you and Charlie do. Absolutely brilliant. And why is it important? Well, it's important because 10,000 years ago, we as a species changed the course of human history. 10,000 years ago, we switched from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to settlers, agriculturalists. And becoming settlers saw us effectively create a contract with the soil, which became the bedrock of our civilization. For millennia, the soil has looked after us. Where does 95% of our food come from? The soil. What holds twice the amount of carbon as the atmosphere? The soil. And what stops most of our rainwater simply running straight back into the sea? The soil. Treat soil like dirt, and we're done. But a single human lifetime ago, we started to do just that. We started to tear up the contract with the soil. We lost sight of soil, animals, and farming as part of nature. We removed farm animals from the land. We put them into cages and confinement, treating them like machines on factory farms. We use chemical pesticides and fertilizers that wreak havoc on natural ecosystems. And that is why the UN has warned, carry on as we are, and we have 60 years left in the world's soils. No soil, no food, game over. Which is why change is inevitable. But what does change look like? Well, for me, it looks like a veritable 3 R's approach: regenerative farming, reduction of animal-sourced foods, and rewilding, not least of the soil. Let's take the first, regenerative, nature-friendly farming. That involves restoring animals to the land as part of rotational grazers, where they can express their natural behaviors, running, flapping, grazing, making for happier animals with better health too. Regenerative farming cuts reliance on chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and antibiotics, so it actually reduces farmers' costs and creates a varied, nature-rich landscape. The second R is rethinking protein. We need to reduce the number of farmed animals. If we carry on eating meat on the trend line, where year on year we as a species are eating more meat than ever before, we carry on that trend line, then our food alone will trigger catastrophic climate change. So we need to rein it back in. Alternative proteins like plant-based, cultivated meat and precision fermentation hold the ability for us to transform our diets and reduce the amount of overall animal products that we have. making sure that we can have that regenerative, nature-friendly farming, but also meaning that we can rewild not least the soil. Soil is the most amazing arbiter of nature. A handful of soil has more living organisms than the amount of people on the planet. If we take a football pitch patched size of healthy soil, it should have 4 million worms. It should have 13,000 species. Think of that. A brilliant symphony of plants and animals locking away carbon, holding in water, making our food. And what's a big component to help boost soil fertility and allow all that to happen? Bringing animals out of factory farms, returning to the land as rotational grazers and foragers. In this way, we can help ensure that farmed animals experience the joy of living. And by ending factory farming, we can create landscapes that are bursting with life. We can transform the outlook from just 60 harvests left to a wondrous, nature-friendly future for our children. We have the power to shape a new, compassionate world for all. Let's bring it on. Thank you.
That was brilliant, Philip. Very concise and very incisive, with an awful lot there to think about, especially about how we're going to feed ourselves and such like things in the future. But obviously, what is very important in both what you have said and what Izzy has said is really what the markets are going to do, what the investors are going to do. So I'm thrilled to be introducing our next speaker, who is Sophie Lawrence, who works with Rathbones Green Bank, and where she is absolutely plugged into all the new work on biodiversity, on nutrition, on assessing the social and environmental performance of the companies that Rathbones is involved in. So, Sophie, over to you. Difficult one to pick up, but I'm really eager to hear what you have to say about how you can move finance to help all these all our climate issues as well as our environmental ones. Over to you.
Thank you, Rosie. And I have the difficult task of making finance exciting for you all in the context of this really important kind of topic that we're focusing on, which is Earth. And it's great to be contributing to this panel this evening. So I want to pose and answer 3 core questions in my opening remarks, or scratch the surface of answering, I should say. Firstly, why is biodiversity important to investors? So alongside there being a strong moral imperative to act on this issue due to the worsening trends that we are witnessing in biodiversity loss, there is also a growing awareness among the finance sector of the risks that biodiversity loss poses. We've already heard that, our long-term survival, our day-to-day quality of life, and all economic activities depend on the state of our natural capital, either directly or indirectly. So thinking about the finance sector specifically, and this diagram looks at how financial institutions are connected to natural ecosystems through the activities of the companies that they either finance, insure, or invest in. Depending on their sector and the specific activities, these companies depend on nature and impact nature, or both. And the operations of 4 major value chains, food, energy, infrastructure, and fashion, currently are driving more than 90% of man-made pressure on biodiversity. And our reliance on biodiversity and ecosystem services leads to several risks that need to be fully understood. Very briefly, physical risks, so risks that arise directly from a decline in ecosystem services. An example could be a risk to physical assets such as buildings due to the reliance on regulating ecosystem services such as coastal protection. Transition risks, and these arise when companies are not aligned with rapidly changing regulation. And also the systemic risk, which looks at how tipping points can be reached by large-scale failure of ecosystem services. The second question I want to look at is, why is it important that the financial sector is looking seriously at this issue? And I think there are 2 core parts to this. First, there is the need to reduce the financing of harmful activities, which are reducing biodiversity loss, through the better understanding of where those risks lie in our portfolios, and then using that influence that we have as financiers in those companies to engage with them on this topic. And second, we need to invest in natural assets such as nature-based solutions. And on the latter, there is a wealth of compelling research finding that there is currently a vast gap between the current financing and what level is required if we're going to deliver the nature-related outcomes of the current plans we have laid out. And that could be on the UK level, also the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed in COP15 in December. And there's a role for several different actors in getting us there. And an increase in public finance and philanthropy can get us some of the way in filling that financing gap. But we're unlikely to get there unless we see a significant private sector investment as well. The final question I want to briefly look at was, why was COP15 so pivotal from a finance sector perspective? So some of you may have been watching what happened at COP15 just before Christmas. You'll be forgiven if you didn't. There wasn't as much media attention as we hoped on the conference. I was actually out there in Montreal as part of the Finance for Biodiversity delegation. And just a couple of very brief remarks, which we can maybe pick up further in further detail in the questions. So the global agreement between over 190 countries was no doubt a historic first step in reversing biodiversity loss this decade, but it marks the beginning, not the end of the journey. To implement the targets, including conserving 30% of the Earth's land, sea, inland water and coastal areas by 2030, which became the headline target from COP15, but isn't the whole story, will involve unprecedented collaboration globally. It'll involve new circular business models, which can maintain social safeguards within the frame of our natural system boundaries. It will involve reimagining our global food system, as Philip was picking on, and changing our consumption and production habits, as well as ambitious governance from our national leaders. And that's naming only a few of the transformative changes that we need to see. To end my remarks on a slightly more kind of positive note, I think a few things that we can be hopeful about when we're thinking about the finance sector and biodiversity. So first, we've seen a growing amount of initiatives and individuals mobilizing across different stakeholder groups focused on reversing biodiversity loss this decade. We are getting better at linking work on nature and biodiversity to climate change, but we need to continue to do that at scale if we're going to avoid duplication of effort. And that is also looking at regulatory standards and international policy making. But there has been significant interest in understanding and engagement with the issue from the finance sector. At Greenbank, we had our Investor Day on biodiversity in 2010, and it wasn't on the finance agenda then, I think it's fair to say. But now there are innovative new financing models emerging to support long-term sustainability outcomes. We've seen a rapid growth of signatories to the Finance for Biodiversity pledge, now 126 signatories globally, committed to setting ambitious biodiversity targets and reporting their impacts publicly. And just a really small signal of the real demand, we saw a new collaborative investor engagement program called Nature Action 100+ receive interest from over 100 financial institutions before it was even launched at COP15. So there's definitely a long journey ahead, and I'm absolutely not here to say that we have solved it within the finance sector community yet, but hopefully some signs of optimism and some aspects we can pick up further in the questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie. That was incredibly interesting. And you touched on so many issues. I mean, the fundamental thing is that this isn't going to happen without the private sector and without the right kind of funding. So it's great to have you involved in this discussion, and indeed to have Rathbones involved in this discussion. Now, one of the expressions we've been throwing around a bit is natural capital, which I think sometimes is difficult to understand what exactly it means. So I'm thrilled that our next speaker, Siddharth Srikanth, is he works in climate and nature investing, and he's previously worked in sustainability for such companies as McKinsey, and he's also worked in environmental policy for the World Bank. Now, his new book is called The Case for Nature. It comes out in May, but it's one of the things that Siddharth looks at, which is what exactly is the natural capital of the world, and why is it so incredibly important to every single one of us? Siddharth, Sid, as he likes to be known, Sid, over to you.
Thank you very much. At the core of the Case for Nature is a simple idea. that nature is both priceless and that it has value that we mostly fail to recognize. Some of the value is economic. And as you said, the notion of natural capital helps us understand that value in terms of things like carbon storage and flood prevention and pollination and so on. The book does dive into some of these economic systems, but Sophie already did a great job of telling us more about the risks and some of the opportunities here. The other piece of the book is that nature's value is also intrinsic, cultural, and spiritual. And it's tempting to think of these two imperatives as entirely separate. In today's talk, I'd love to introduce the idea that we might be able to hold both sets of imperatives in our minds and in our hearts. To lay my own cards on the table, the intrinsic case for nature has, on its own, always been more than enough for me. I was raised by a family of conservationists in India. I studied conservation biology. I've worked on projects all over the world. And conservation efforts haven't been in vain. They have resulted in protection for some amazing ecosystems across the world. This has often been at the expense of traditional custodians of the land. And what we've been left with is a patchwork of reasonably well-protected fortresses that add up to about 15% of the Earth's surface, surrounded by an ever-expanding human imprint. The case for nature offers us a way of thinking about what we might do for the other 85%. So we absolutely can start with the economic case and recognize the ways in which our natural capital assets sustain us. But the intrinsic case is just as important. And we can take inspiration from indigenous cultures across the world. The word ecology comes from the Greek oikos, which means home. And I think seeing ourselves as guardians of a living planet through deep time can lead us to make decisions rather differently. Sustainability takes on a deeper meaning when it operates on millennial rather than quarterly reporting timescales. Not that the latter isn't important. I love this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which prompts us to reflect on our relationship to nature. She says, knowing that you love the earth changes you. It activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street to a sacred bond. Now, one of my favorite stories in the book combines traditional guardianship with the latest in technology and economic models. Last year, I visited Wilson, a Maasai leader from Silenke on the Kenya-Tanzania border. Wilson grew up walking amongst lions, giraffe, and elephants. But because many Maasai have in recent years been forced to sell their lands to make ends meet, what happens then is fences spring up on what was previously open land. It disrupts the fantastic East African animal migrations you will have seen on TV. And Wilson and his Maasai community have been left with a really tricky situation. What I saw was that they teamed up with data scientists and businessy types, including a friend of mine, Viraj, and they began by mapping out the entire ecosystem they steward using drones and satellite data. They're now working to keep that land in Maasai hands by accurately measuring the carbon and other ecosystem services that their stewardship provides. Now, study after study has shown that securing indigenous land tenure can help protect and restore natural ecosystems. But I think we all have to reflect on the fact that indigenous groups like the Maasai must still reckon with the forces of the market economy. Now, if they're truly able to make free and informed choices, some First Nations groups will justifiably choose isolation. Those choices deserve to be respected. But others will choose to pair cultural integrity with economic and social development, and to finally receive some financial support in return for the public goods they provide to the whole planet. The framing is really important. One reflection I had, having spent time with indigenous groups across the world, was a sense of relationship and connection, of deeply valuing and sustainably harnessing the entire spectrum of services that nature provides, then giving back, rather than ridding nature of human influence and seeing ourselves as separate from nature, in some ways seeing ourselves as the virus. So in some ways, this thinking isn't so different from natural capital. It is a world away from this arm's length relationship to nature inherent in old school colonial style conservation, which is effectively put a fence around it, kick out all the people, and hopefully we can save some nature. So I think I'd like to leave us with this. I think we all have to become more comfortable with nuance. When these twin economic and intrinsic imperatives come into conflict, we have a responsibility to resolve them openly and honestly. In my mind, to make the case for nature, we'll have to rely both on our heads and on our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sid. I think that you posed a lot of really, really interesting questions that we now have the chance to take forward a bit among the five of us, the four of you and me. And then we're going to come to questions from the audience, which I can see lots coming in. So thank you very much, and keep them coming. And they look really great. Indeed, I may nick a few on the way through in the next 10 or 15 minutes. But let me come back to Izzy and this question of, how that nature is both something that is very good for your heart and obviously quite essential for the planet. And how should we, I understand obviously that you can see pictures in China of people having to hand pollinate something because they've used so many pesticides they have no more bees left, so they're pollinating apple trees. How do we resolve this in terms of a payment for natural services? Do we need to do that, or can we count on people's goodwill?
I think a bit of both. I think there is definitely a groundswell now of feeling. I don't know if you feel it too. I mean, in the last couple of years, I think we've turned a corner in many ways, and we have, we've had Extinction Rebellion, we've got Greta Thunberg, we've got David Attenborough, we've got the plastics revolution. And suddenly all coming together at one point, and say 3 or 4 years ago, and now people really feeling that they're missing something in the world out there, that we are missing all this life, and we need to get it back. So I think there's a big public awareness and discomfort, and perhaps even eco-anxiety acting now. But obviously, getting people to actually change their ways, particularly if you are a farmer and you've been farming in a particular way for generations, and it's a very, very difficult thing. And the money, the practicalities of it is what makes people actually sit up and think. So I think certainly, we've got to have incentives from government. We've got to have things like ELM to incentivize land managers to think differently about how we manage the land, and to do it more sustainably and resourcefully, and actually grow life back on the land again. But I think Sophie will know more about this, and all the panel will know more about this than me. But it does seem to me that the private sector is going to play a huge part in this, because whenever there is an economic crisis like we're in at the moment, nature, no matter how much we intellectually know we depend on it, hits the back seat again. And we need to have that money released from the private sector that's going to be able to change things. Governments are never going to have enough will or money to make the change as on such a large scale and as quickly as we need it. Sorry, Rosie, I think you're on mute.
You see that as systems of carbon credits?
Yeah, so one of the things that Charlie, my husband, has been working on recently is the sort of biodiversity credit sort of system, whereby, we've been so focused on the carbon credit system, and obviously that in many ways is terrible for the environment. It can be, you could be planting Sitka spruce on peatland, and you're doing absolutely the wrong thing for the environment and for biodiversity. So just chasing the carbon can actually lead us into real problems. So if you can measure biodiversity, and that has been the problem, is having a system whereby you can compare biodiversity credits across the planet. And we now, there are many people looking at this in different ways, but one of the ones we've been working with is the Wallacea Trust, who have come up with a way of comparing biodiversity uplift on a coral reef or a tropical rainforest, for example, with a farm in West Sussex. So that, I think, is going to be a breakthrough, where we can show that stacking carbon credits on top of biodiversity credits, that sweet spot where you're doing both, is going to be what private companies are going to want to do.
That's great. That's such an encouraging answer too. Philip, do you see no role at all for animals for farming for meat? I mean, do you see a future where we're going to have pretty much everything coming from newly created sources of protein?
Well, the reality is that there are more animals farmed every year now than at any other time in history, and that just keeps on increasing with every day, week, or month that goes on at the moment. So, looking at where we're at, the imperative is that we've got to move away from a system that is heavily dependent and increasingly hugely unsustainably dependent on the production of masses of livestock produced industrially in factory farms. And to put a figure on it, to get our food back to fit within planetary boundaries, there's good science to show that we need to reduce the amount of meat and dairy that we're producing and consuming by about 60% by 2050. So what I see, Rosie, is a portfolio approach to tackling that intrinsic problem. The first thing that we need to do is to see governments and companies setting targets for the reduction of meat and dairy. Compass Group in the UK and Ireland have already set a target to reduce livestock production, the amounts of products that they're using, by 40% by 2030. And what we need to, and the way that we can do that is through replacing a proportion of our meat and dairy using plant-based, or coming back to your question, cultivated meat from stem cells, or precision fermentation that can produce precise proteins, and making sure that absolutely we move away from factory farming and that we restore the animals that we're farming to a respectful, enjoyable life back on the land where they can boost soil health as part of regenerative farming. That is the way. Food production, nature, and animal welfare brought together in synergy.
Does it worry you that we might end up with big giant corporations that are rather shadowy, producing all this kind of new food, and that we have another, there's quite a lot of questions coming in about big corporations. Are we replacing one big corporation with another big corporation?
I think the key thing is to have transparency and openness over the production methods. And frankly, if we'd had transparency and openness a long time ago, the big corporations that have been responsible for driving factory farming wouldn't have got where they are today. The reason why we have factory farmed animals, caged, crammed and confined, is because they're behind closed doors, out of sight, out of mind. There's nothing on the label to tell you the animals are factory farmed. If it did, people wouldn't buy it. That's the fact of the matter. So I do think openness and transparency is important. But what's really important, Rosie, is that we move quickly now, because I estimate that we've got 20 years left to turn the tide of the impending emergencies of climate and the collapse of nature, pollution and disease. These are all things that are exacerbated and to some extent driven by our continued factory farming.
That's not very long, Philip. That's not very long at all. So Sophie, I mean, I'd like to ask you, to start with the sort of feeling of that. Do you get that sense of urgency around where people are? I mean, I know someone I know quite well who runs a big capital fund, he has a real sense that if people invest in different kinds of, say, fossil fuels, whatever, that you will be looking at stranded assets within a decade or so as the rules come in about alternative energy. He's in a hurry. Do you feel that the people you work with and you yourself, that you're in a hurry?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think just thinking about some signals of that, I think absolutely yes, and we've seen a real increased momentum. I think some of the things, just briefly, that have helped with that, you've had large consulting firms, BCG for example, put out Biodiversity in Business last year. I've seen that quoted in a lot of different places. The World Economic Forum kind of stat of half of global capital is dependent either directly or indirectly on biodiversity. So you've got those headlines. I think in terms of signals of that really being picked up. I mean, COP15 was a good example. There was a real presence from the finance sector, not only as there at the negotiations and sort of the presence and perhaps you'd say risk of kind of just being seen to be doing the right thing, but also in the run up and the negotiations. So Finance for Biodiversity, we were really active in the negotiations running up to COP15, calling for very specific measures, calling for the explicit mention of private as well as public finance being really critical to the implementation of any framework, calling for the fact that we needed mandatory reporting of companies and their biodiversity impacts and dependencies. And I think that's a really key one. And actually, I think there's a role, I think we're hearing it already throughout this conversation, there's absolutely a role for the finance and private sector. There's also a real role for well-designed regulation that is setting, the consistent framework really for private sector to follow. Because if we do start to think about some of those barriers to further private investment, that lack of a kind of clear policy roadmap is definitely there as a real challenge. And I think we have to remember that the COP15, as ambitious as it was in a framework, it's not mandatory. So we really are now hoping to see long-term consistent policy signals. And I think that will really help in driving further investment. But I think without it, it will be difficult. But yes, that urgency is there. I'm seeing that. Obviously, we are sort of maybe a little bit biased in the bubble that we're in and working on this topic so actively with our counterparts. But we can't fail in the, to not look at it. I think, I think the sort of stranded assets will start to become, part of the parlance when we're thinking about nature as well. And, what real risk is there in portfolios if you continue to ignore it?
And one final thing with you, I mean, you mentioned when you were talking about the significant financing gaps. What are the barriers that currently prevent more private investment market into this area?
Yeah, so we've mentioned the regulation, and I think that is really important. We've also mentioned that nature and the ecosystem services are undervalued, and that is a real challenge. And that means there are currently limited sources of revenue which investors can get from nature, which sounds quite. We're thinking about this from an investment perspective, but it's really important if you're going to mobilize the significant kind of scale of capital. So that's something we need to think about, and maybe we can come on to look at kind of, and I'm sure Sid is a real expert here in how do we actually value nature and bring that into the kind of decision making. Just a couple of others to pick up on. There is also a lack of consistency in how we report and measure biodiversity. There's a lot of regulation that's going to be helping that, such as the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. And because it is a relatively new area to invest in, it's hard to kind of price the risk of nature-based solutions. And generally the finance sector likes to be able to predict how things are going to play out in the long term. So we need to be able to, and there's a lot of innovation kind of happening here, but just really sort of think about those innovative financing mechanisms. What do they look like? What risk is associated with them? How long term are we looking for investment to be deployed? Those are all questions I think we need to work through and answer if we're going to get beyond just that sort of small project financing, but really think about mobilizing a really significant amount of finance towards this topic. That's great.
I mean, Sid, does this do you feel optimistic about this, or do you look at not so much the Montreal talks, but although that I think many people have said they got very little publicity, and that's also a bit depressing. But going back to the talks in Egypt, and there was a lot of allegations made that there was a lot of greenwashing going on at that, and that now the fact that the next COP is going to be in the UAE, and the president of the COP is also the president of the oil company. I mean, how do you see it from someone who worked for McKinsey's and who's worked in all those finance areas, that is the world really serious about tackling this, or is it let's make hay while the sun shines?
Yeah, and I think for me, I have to be optimistic is the short answer. But if we talk about what's happened with the climate summits, I think we have seen a shift. I've seen this in my own life, just in the people around me, who've gone from seeing climate as something we should be doing, but it's something for governments to be doing, really, to the stuff of careers and businesses and investments, right? I think we have successfully made that shift. Now we're nowhere near where we need to be and we're far off track, but I think that kind of psychological shift is huge. And so I think, Egypt may have been disappointing for some and the next one may be disappointing for others, but the amount of momentum and energy you see in each of those climate summits tells you something about the shift we've seen in the focus of our economies. I think the trouble with nature is we haven't done the same thing. I think when you describe nature and investing in nature or natural capital, the answer you usually get back is, I love nature. I went on this amazing hike, or I went on this beautiful holiday, and those are amazing things. I think we're building on a bedrock of genuine love for nature. But I think that psychological shift of saying it's both that and it can be the stuff of businesses and careers and government policy and everything else. I don't think we've made that shift yet. So I think I'm optimistic that we can, and these conversations help. But I think that the biggest thing we need to communicate, I think, is that it's possible to build economic systems that value nature more fully than they currently value them.
And whose responsibility is that?
I mean, I put the responsibility back on everyone who's listening to this. I mean, wherever you are, if you're in a career that touches, everyone's career touches environment and climate and nature in some way. But I think even talking about it in those terms can really help. And the first step, I think, is to recognize it and say, I really believe it. So you might not, right? But I think if you can get to that level of conviction and then ask the people around you to begin thinking about it in that way, I think it can be a really powerful shift. And governments follow, I think. Governments will follow that shift into, they will be reflecting policy and so on. But I think, like I said, those twin imperatives, we shouldn't let go of the fact that intrinsically nature is incredible and we should build this relationship with nature. And the fact that economically, time's running out and we have to do what we can.
Okay, thank you all very much. I'm now going to turn to the torrent, literal torrent of questions that are coming in, and I won't get to all of them, I'm sorry, so I'm apologizing in advance. But Sid, can I stay with you? And again, this is a question that we've had in various versions, but do you believe that persistent economic growth is compatible with protecting nature? Take the philosophical end.
Yeah, I think the question is, it's an interesting question to ask. I'm not sure we have much choice. I think the end of persistent economic growth effectively says to quite a lot of people, you can no longer, develop and build the same types of lives that we now have in the developed world. Or you're saying we cap economic growth and we make the developed world poorer so we can make the developing world richer. One of those two things has to be true. And I can see the philosophical argument for it. I really can, in terms of the limits of growth. I don't see that flying with either the developed world or the developing world. So I think we have to work with what we have. And I think we have to also remember that the market is a human construct. It currently reflects values that we embedded in that market. And we can embed a different set of values and get a very different set of outcomes. So I'm very happy to work with what we have rather than engaging with that question, even though I think it's a really interesting question to ask philosophically.
Okay, that's a really interesting answer. Sophie, if we ask you the same question, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting response, Sid, and I was sort of nodding along because, I would broadly kind of agree with that. I think something that we do have to be mindful of, and I'm going to pick out kind of very small snippet of this. Please do go and read the kind of 500-page report because it is actually fascinating. But Dasgupta report on the economics of biodiversity. And I think, one aspect of this kind of question, which I think we need to think about, is obviously we've become so reliant on using GDP as a measure of economic performance, but obviously that fails to kind of include the depreciation of the assets. So, for example, degradation of our natural environment. So I do think we need to be really have our eyes wide open that is a measure of economic activity, but it's unsuitable for perhaps kind of appraising, investment projects or really identifying sustainable development. So I think that's the first thing I would say. I think the second is, and another fascinating book, if anyone's interested in kind of going to read it, and I'm sure a lot of people of this already have, but Donut Economics. And, this thinking of how do we live within our, planetary boundaries, but also maintain the social safeguards. And I do think, that can be a sort of a process of change with our current economic system. I would agree with Sid. It's about thinking about, you know, broader stakeholders as well as just shareholder returns, and we already have, you know, models like that, whether it's the B Corporation movement and the benefit corporation structure in the US. So I think, you know, we have the ability to actually change the current model, but I think we also have to be mindful of, you know, some of these measures where we have quite simplistically thought of them as measures of economic success, whether those really tell the full story, especially as we enter this kind of new era of potential kind of tipping points being reached, and us having to really understand some of the sustainability challenges that we're facing much more within the, you know, the economic context than we ever have before.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you, Sophie. Izzy, I would like to ask you that question, but I'm not going to, because we've only got 10 minutes and I want to move along to a different topic. And it's a very good one, sort of food-wise. If farmers reduce the amount of fertilizers and insecticides, surely their yields will reduce.
I think that's a really astonishing thing. Philip would be able to answer this too, but there are many studies now and many farmers farming in a regenerative way, which show that you can have almost, if not more, increase your yields if you are farming regeneratively. And it makes absolute sense, because if you have a soil that is actually functioning, and you have the natural resources around you to provide all the things that will help you grow crops without inputs, it actually is not only produces the same amount of food, but it produces more profit for the farmer because there's lower inputs, and it produces more nutritious food. And this is hugely important. You know, one of the massive costs to civilization at the moment is ill health, because we eat food that is poor in nutrition, because it's not taking up the essential nutrients from the soil. So it's a win-win-win situation. It as far as I understand, again, Philip would be better at answering this than me, but it does take a time for a farm to move into transition into a fully functioning soils, and where you've got your natural processes, if you like. You've got nature working with you rather than against you. And I think it's that transition that the kind of payments like ELM are really important for, is actually to be able to pay a farmer during those years when the yields will drop as it transitions into a sustainable system. I did notice someone saying on the chat, you know, if we return to a system of farming before the war, wouldn't that be a simpler way of putting it, rather than regenerative farming? But I think the key difference with regenerative farming is not ploughing. That is the one invention that again and again we've invented over the planet, and again civilizations have fallen because we've degenerated our soils, we've lost our soils because we've just been shredding them year on year on year. So that is the difference, I think, between the new movement of regenerative farming and the previous system of rotational farming we had before.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. So Philip, there's a couple of questions here that are about cheap meat and meat, etc. I mean, one is, how do you wean the poor of the developed countries from cheap meat, which in a sense is the same as saying, how do we deny people the instant power of fossil fuels when we have had so much to gain from them? And the other question, which I find very interesting, I mean, children are still given toy farms, which perpetuate this fairy tale long vanished version of a farm. So what role should education play? I mean, I think there's a lot you can do about truthful labeling, but it is amazing how often you see Farmer Giles and his happy pig on some sausage meat that no doubt has never seen the light of day as such.
You're absolutely right, Rosie, that we absolutely need honest labeling. We need labeling on meat and dairy that tells us how the food was produced, how the animal lived and died. And if the animals are kept on a factory farm, it should say intensively produced or caged or factory farmed. Why not? If the producers that are producing food that way are proud of the way they produce, why wouldn't they put it on the label? We know the answer, but that's not an excuse for not being honest. And in terms of where the the change needs to come in terms of who needs to reduce their meat consumption. Well, the onus is on those countries, those parts of the world that are consuming the most, and those are the developed parts of the world: the UK, Europe, USA, and so on. And in these regions, we need to see reductions in the order of 70 to 80% within a fairly short time span. If we're to hit targets, then really we should be trying to reach those reduction levels by 2030. How are we going to do that? Well, by getting behind the alternatives that are increasingly giving meat a run for its money, plant-based alternatives, and getting behind the new technologies that are bubbling up. So cell-based cultivated meat from stem cells produced in a bioreactor is a great way of reducing the carbon footprint, reducing the amount of land hugely that is needed to produce meat, and of course it would be slaughter-free.
Yes, well, you're right. And all those are really good points as to where we head. So we're just about up to time. And got one question here that has come from California that I'm personally, because this happens to be a bugbear of mine. And we've also had a question earlier in the day about it as well. Questioner says, I'm very concerned that with the emphasis on reducing use of fossil fuels, there's a move to present bioenergy, which is basically from forests, as green and renewable, when in fact it's devastating to both climate, as trees are cut down, and to biodiversity. I'm writing from California, where the move towards increasing production of bioenergy and biofuels is escalating. How can the financial sector prevent this? And I'd love to, Sophie, I'd love to get your take on this, and then I'd also love to get Izzy's take on this, because you've got a lot of trees. So, Sophie, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, how we think about this is not just kind of looking for the bio in the title and thinking that's automatically good. It would have absolutely the same rigorous screen as any other investment that we would take. And we, for those reasons, and for the environmental challenges you've already outlined, Rosie, wouldn't be seeing that as a viable solution. I think when we look at this topic, it's actually, it's fair to say it's very challenging to find, or at least we find it very challenging to find sort of companies that we would align to this theme of habitats and ecosystems. We've got 8 themes that define how we invest at Greenbank, and there isn't a huge amount in that area right now, and that doesn't mean that we sort of force anything in. It's actually that we haven't got anything to invest in that's in the public market right now, and that's why we're really looking at some of these innovative private market kind of impactful opportunities. So yeah, in short, absolutely don't just look at the bio and the title. It's a much kind of deeper analysis than that, and yeah, that wouldn't be an alternative. Just to pick up on what Philip said, we are very excited about some of the alternative proteins, and actually we've just been working on a paper kind of looking at the relative social and environmental impacts of the different pieces that Philip outlined. So that's a really exciting area for us, and also kind of crosses over with the health and well-being focus as well.
So, Izzy, do you, in a way, this is probably going to have to be the last question, so I'm going to have to wrap up with what you would ask everyone to do individually. But on a sort of broader level, biomass, I'd love to know your views on. And also, you produce meat that is run wild, you restrict us. I always love the fact that you and Charlie use the expression that you have to be the apex predator because we don't allow wolves in this country, which always sort of stuck with me as like a really interesting thing, that you have to manage the stock. I mean, what do you feel about moving into alternative protein sources, and finally, what would you tell everyone the one thing they can do?
My worry about the alternative protein sources is first of all, do we know, if we're going into sort of the bacteria world, do we know actually what our bodies are taking up, what we need? We're still assuming that we know better than nature, and I'd also worry that as I think you hinted at earlier on, that we might be just jumping into the hands of another Monsanto and Syngenta, who stitch up food production and have us in their grasp again. I think essentially if a food production system isn't at the end of the day a carbon sink, if it's not actually reducing carbon, then it is probably not something we should be embracing. I think regenerative agriculture is something that can produce food and sink carbon. So that to me is, let's work with nature first. But I do admit, we do need to try everything. We have to embrace, keep an open mind. As to what everyone can do, I mean, I think that's the wonderful thing, is that we can all do a bit. Even, if all the amount of soil we have is in a window box or a planter outside our door, we can do something to bring butterflies back, pollinating insects, and particularly if we can connect with neighbours and think strategically how we can perhaps influence local councils to increase the amount of nature that will make that pot of plant life connect with another. And that's, we've just got to think, how can we become that webbing that needs to sustain us all?
I like that expression, the webbing that sustains us all. Philip, what would you say to all our audience?
I'd say seize the power of your plate and eat more plants, less but better meat. And by better, I mean that comes from pasture-fed, free-range, or regenerative.
Thank you. And Sophie?
Ask your pension provider how they're thinking about nature and biodiversity, or if you do have investments, your investment manager, check out the website Make My Money Matter if you want some tips there. Yeah, that would be mine.
That's a great website. Yeah, thank you very much for giving that a plug. I'm really glad that we got that in. And Sid, what would you say?
I just say become comfortable with nuance. There are really no easy answers here, so we need a bit of everything. We should be okay not knowing all the answers.
Yeah, okay. Well, listen, thank you very, very much to our four speakers, to Izzy, to Sophie, to Sid, and to Philip. Thank you, a big thank you to all the audience. There's so many of you here tonight, and thank you very much for sending in such great questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but I hope I covered, at least by picking them, that I knew, there were several questions on the kind of areas, but please keep coming back. And as I say, we're back again on February the 20th, same time, 6 o'clock, and Earth, Air, Fire and Water. Next time we're doing water, slightly out of sync, I can see, but anyway, so it's oceans, rivers, droughts and pollution in waters. And the speakers include the wonderful Adam Nicholson, whose latest book is about life between the tides, Alak Jar, who's written a really good book called Water, and Tobias Jones, who has been looking at what has happened to Italy and its food system, and indeed, in fact, the whole life of northern Italy when the Po dried up. So a little window into the future. So please come and join us then. You can register on the 5x15 website. And I know that on your screens, not my screen, but your screens, you'll have a feedback panel, and we'd be incredibly appreciative if you were able to fill it in. So good night to everyone. Good night to our speakers. And once again, thank you very much for joining us, and Happy New Year too. Bye-bye.